Kelly. So I am delighted to introduce Kelly Zaromsky. I've known Kelly for a while. She worked on a fellowship at Harvard with Matt Nock's lab and the Military Suicide Research Consortium and Army Stars. And I was also working on the Military Suicide Research Consortium and was just amazed at what you all can do with computers and big data. So I have been impressed with Kelly's work for a long time, and when I was when Keating and I were at the ABCT last year, Kelly presented on some really cool work she's been doing on bringing this to crisis services. And so I really wanted to have her come and present that here. Kelly is a licensed clinical psychologist and principal clinical research scientist on the research and impact team at the Crisis Text Line. Her research focuses on improving the prediction and prevention of suicide, with a particular interest in exploring how technology can be harnessed to identify at-risk individuals and deliver interventions outside of traditional healthcare settings. Previously, she was the director of research at Franciscan Children's Hospital in Brighton, Massachusetts, and a research scientist in the Department of Psychology at Harvard. She received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology at Auburn and completed her postdoc at Harvard prior to working at Franciscan and now, since March, at the Crisis Text Line. Thank you so much, Kelly, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the intro. Let me just do the Zoom thing about figuring out that you can all see my screen. I can start. Okay, can I get some thumbs up if it looks good? Okay, great. Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you all today. This is a project that I was involved in and led for several years at Harvard. Some of this work is still ongoing. I did, as just mentioned, recently transition out of my roles at Harvard and Franciscan into a new principal scientist role at Crisis Text Line, and I'm happy to talk about that transition later, and as well as how this project, I think, it has been a big advantage coming into that role in terms of working with in industry and with engineering and product and executive partners on a project. But everything I'm going to be presenting on today was under the Harvard umbrella from my time there. And I was at Harvard for many years, and it was hard to leave. And also it's been really good, the new position. So again, happy to talk about that more later. So just to orient us all, I'm sure this is something that is familiar, unfortunately, to most of us already, which is the really concerning elevated risk for suicide that we see in veterans and service members. Specifically among active duty service members, the suicide rate has been increasing since 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, Army soldiers are more likely to die by suicide than in combat. This, of course, has raised a lot of questions and a lot of work and a lot of resources aimed at how can we better prevent military suicides. One of the problems for anyone who is experiencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors is that most people at risk for suicide are not presenting for mental health treatment prior to their deaths. And among service members specifically, only a quarter of service members who die by suicide were actually seen by a mental health professional in the month before their death. There are a lot of very valid reasons why service members are not seeking out care. This is coming from some work I did with Army Stars during my postdoc fellowship, looking at reasons, barriers to seeking treatment. And there are a lot of perceived concerns that receiving mental health care would hurt their careers, reduce others' confidence in them, or lead others to see them as weak. And unfortunately, for a lot of these concerns, these are not unfounded. There are very real career impacts for having mental health concerns, known mental health concerns, or reporting that you're feeling suicidal if you're in active duty. So an ideal situation would be to be able to identify at-risk folks outside of traditional healthcare settings in another context where we could deliver resources to them without having to introduce concerns about stigma and very real career impact. So one possibility is social media. Most people use social media. A lot of people talk about mental health on social media, and disclosures related to mental health and suicide are fairly common. Given the unique stressors and challenges faced by service members and veterans, many individuals may be more comfortable sharing about their concerns with peers who are kind of better able to understand the culture of the military and the specific nuances of the community. And so this is where our partnership with Rally Point came into play. Rally Point is a social media platform for service members and veterans. They developed it in response to a lack of a dedicated social media space for military personnel. And they have an active user base of around 2 million service members and veterans. And users can go on the site, connect, get support around different topics like deployment, military life, and mental health. Rally Point describes their site as kind of a combination of LinkedIn and Facebook, which I think is pretty accurate. Like when you go onto the site, it's like a news feed like you would see on Facebook. And then you see posts from people talking about things like deployment, military life, but then kind of interspersed, there is more career discussion and discussion about reintegration after deployment and transitioning back into civilian life and things like that. And so there is kind of a LinkedIn-ish element as well. People will often post about their mental health concerns and sometimes suicidal thoughts and behaviors on the site, which is where this partnership initially emerged because Rally Point was having a hard time and navigating how to handle when those suicidal posts were coming up. And so this is the prior system that they were using. I'll just walk you through it briefly. When they would see a post that was suicidal on Rally Point. So a user would create a concerning post. It might look something like this. This is an actual post from the site from a while ago before we got involved with them. Person talking about traumatic event that they experienced every day, every hour, sometimes each minute or second. I must decide to live with the nightmares, the fear, the anger, or end it all by killing myself. And then they talk about a bunch of different methods that they've considered. This post is obviously talking about suicide. Before we began our partnership with Rally Point, the only two ways that this post would make its way to someone who could get resources to this person was either other Rally Point users could just happen to see this post in their feed and then flag it. There's a flag button. It's not shown here. It's like on the bottom corner of the post. This would send a notification to Rally Point moderators who could then reach out. Or the Rally Point admins or moderators could also just happen to see the post themselves and flag it. When it was flagged, what would happen next is that a Rally Point employee, like Carlos here, would reach out to the person in two ways. They would reply as a comment on the post saying like, what can we do to help? And link resources. This resource sheet contains like information on 988 and veteran specific resources, local resources, kind of a list of things. They would also send a DM to the person with the same resources. So of course, I'm sure it's probably obvious to you all that there are a lot of challenges to this prior approach. It was not systematically done. It was reliant on Rally Point users seeing at-risk posts and reporting them, or the moderators just kind of happening upon these posts. And of course, that means there might be a pretty big time delay between when someone's actually posting at-risk content and when they receive a follow-up. And there's also likely a lot of missing, ambiguous or vague posts that users might not classify on their own as at risk. So phrases like, wouldn't it be nice to go to sleep and not wake up? This is something that we would read and think, wow, that could be an indicator of suicide risk. Other lay people might not read that the same way. There's also the element of just what posts are being shown to whom. And if you post at an off time of day or a time when not many people are on the site, and then your post ends up getting buried by other content that comes in, just not that many people might see a post you make. But how it works on Rally Point is every post you make is shown to everyone who's on the site. It's not just like to your friends or people in your community. So it is a broad potential reach of the post, but it's uncertain how big the reach of any given post will be, just based on a lot of the other factors, time of day and other content that's being shared at the same time. So Rally Point's ask of us was, can we figure out a way to automatically identify suicidal posts on the sites that we're missing fewer people so we can then figure out what to do next after we do identify these folks? That's where the current project came into play. This was a collaborative effort between people at Harvard, including myself, Rally Point, and also folks at MIT with some engineering support from AWS. We received funding from an SBIR grant from the Air Force. It had a couple no-cost extensions on that. It just ended last year. And there were two primary aims of this project. The first was to do what Rally Point originally asked, develop and test some automated machine learning driven methods to be identifying users at risk for suicide. And then to figure out what to do next. What kind of interventions can we deliver to these folks? How can we help improve mental health and reduce suicide risk of users of this platform? So I'll start first by talking about the aim one about developing the machine learning model. And just an overview of where we're going with the methods. I'll talk about our data collection and labeling process, our pre-processing steps, and then the machine learning model development and evaluation. I'm trying to keep everything at a fairly high level, but because this is a longer presentation, I go in a little bit more depth, but feel free to ask questions either now or save them to the end. I'm happy to answer. So starting with data collection and labeling, we started with a data set of just over 5 million posts. And these were all of the public posts that had been shared on Rally Point between its inception, which was in 2013 through March 2020. They're all the posts on Rally Point are public. They're public in that anyone on Rally Point can view them. Sometimes you can view them just if you Google stuff and a Rally Point URL might show up. That's a setting you can change, but public in this case means anything that people posted on Rally Point. So it really was their entire corpus. We wanted to label these posts. We needed to have labeled data in order to build our models. We wanted to label the presence or absence of suicide in posts. However, if you take a random subset of 5 million posts, most of these are going to be non-suicidal, right? Like it's still a low base rate phenomenon, suicide risk, even if you're pooling from a group that has a higher than average risk of suicide. So what we did first was we used a weak supervision model to identify a subset of these 5 million posts that were going to be more likely to contain suicide-related descriptions. And how this weak supervision model worked was that it kind of went and searched for words like suicide, PTSD, depression, like other mental health related concerns. And then it estimated a probability score for each post that it reviewed. And that score was the likelihood that the weak supervision model thought that the post contained suicide-related content. So what we did was we took the highest subset of those posts, the ones that were most likely to contain suicide-related content, and then we labeled those. And that was, again, to try to increase the likelihood that we'd actually have some suicidal posts labeled and available for use for testing models. So in the end, we double coded around 8,000 of these posts for the presence or absence of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And this was any description of the user suicidal thoughts and behaviors that could also have included past suicide risk. And I'll talk more about that later, but just based on the low prevalence of the posts, we went very broad with the thought that we would narrow it down to current and past models after the fact. So we started with a model that captured everything from the user's own description of their own experiences. I developed a codebook for this process. Any of the double-coded posts that there was a discrepancy, I reviewed them. We also worked with a third-party labeling company that coded several thousand of these because it was obviously just taking a lot of time to do this. They were really great. I trained them on the same code book, reviewed did spot checks of their labeling and reviewed any discrepancies there. And the final labeled data set, we split into training, validation, and test. Just to give you kind of a flavor of what we're working with, what people are talking about on the site, these are a couple examples of suicidal posts that we labeled as suicidal. This person's talking about taking a bunch of different medications. We got a dog, seems to have a calming effect. spend my time as a recluse. It's hell to live this way. And that, my friend, is why the suicide rate is 22 per day, just not my turn yet. This example highlights some of the kind of military culture specific phrases that we ended up including in our code book to code for, yes, this is a suicidal post. And there were a lot of references to this 22 per day, referencing the kind of commonly referenced statistic in that community that there are 22 veteran suicides a day. And so this was a phrase that we made sure to include in the code book to not be missing sometimes more implied, implicit meaning about someone thinking about suicide without explicitly saying it. As another example, this is someone talking about having PTSD, getting help with the VA. Thank God every day for that help, because without it, I would have been another veteran suicide. Since a little bit more explicit, they're mentioning that they would have attempted suicide. For non-suicidal posts that we included in our code book to exclude for mention of these phrases, we had a good number of people talking about suicide doors on cars. So these were obviously flagged because they had the word suicide, but this has nothing to do with self-harm. So these were excluded. We had a lot of posts where people were talking about general mental health concerns, so talking about PTSD or depression. These are all risk factors for suicide, but there's no explicit or implicit mention of suicide in this post. And so for the purposes of this project, this would be a non-suicidal post. We also had other instances where phrases that sound like they could be related to suicide were coming up. So this post contains the expression kill me, but it's not at all related to suicide. And then we had people describing the suicidal thoughts and behaviors of people they know. So loved ones, friends, family members. This person's talking about their brother who made a suicide attempt. And we were not focused on other people. We were focused on the own user's experience for this project. So in pre-processing, once we had our labeled data, we did do some data augmentation. We generated some additional suicidal posts to help with class imbalance. We still had a pretty big class imbalance, fewer suicidal posts than non-suicidal from the labeling. And so what we did, we had a couple methods for this. Most of them were handcrafted by us of creating additional examples of what a suicidal post might look like. This is something where an LLM would be super helpful nowadays, but this did not exist at the time. But we generated about 100 additional suicidal posts from our team to try to address the class imbalance problem. Then we generated or extracted a bunch of features, vectorized the text from the posts and the title of the post, collected metadata features using, and all this was done in scikit-learn and Python. The final data set included just over 7,600 posts from around 2,700 unique users. Most of the people in our sample were older men who were veterans from the Army. And the sample did include more veterans and older users compared to the average Rally Point user. And we saw that most of the users that were making suicidal posts were veterans in our sample. And this is just a rundown of the cases that we had for the final data set. You can see that we had around 10% of suicidal posts across the training, validation, and test set. So still a pretty heavy class imbalance. Oh, I'm missing a parenthesis there. But higher than it would have been if we had randomly started with 5 million, a subset of 5 million posts. So then we move on to model development and evaluation. We experimented with a lot of different machine learning models, including some classic approaches like logistic regression, but we used a deep learning approach for the final model, specifically from the BERT family of models, which has a lot of advantages of being able to capture more like syntax and contextualized semantics compared to some of the classic approaches. And the final model we used was a Roberta multimodal model that incorporated the text from the user's posts as well as post and user metadata information. So things like what type of post was it? Was it a status update, like an original post, or was it a comment on another post? And then we had this other metric called user engagement score, which is a rally point generated score that they give people based on how often they're posting, how often they're commenting, how often they're on the site as kind of a broad metric of engagement on the site. So our final Roberta model performed well. These are just the main model results here. So around 85% of suicidal posts were correctly flagged by the model, and 96% of non-suicidal posts were correctly classified by the model. Precision was a little bit lower. So of the posts that were predicted to be suicidal, 64% actually were. The F1 score was good, 0.73. The ROC AUC is super inflated. I'm just putting here for reference, but because of the class imbalance, this is not a great metric to look at. So we also looked at precision recall AUC, which is kind of just a more realistic prediction of the future classification performance of the model, and that was also high. Just a note on the precision, because this is kind of a hot topic, or I don't know, maybe it's not a hot topic anymore. There's been a lot of discussion about it in recent years, as machine learning methods have become so widely used. Some people in some groups criticize low precision models, their utility of low precision models, while others have argued that even with low precision, suicide prediction tools can still have clinical value just depending on how they're being used. So in the current project, the goal of this work is to identify people to be getting like very light touch, low burden, like low demand interventions. And so in our case, having a slightly lower precision score is acceptable for this goal. Now, if we were trying to use this model to identify people to be hospitalized or receive some other kind of invasive intervention, we'd want to think more carefully about the cost benefit here. But for our purposes, this lower precision, which honestly isn't even that bad for suicide work, we kind of deemed it as acceptable for this project. We did some additional analysis around the errors. So wanting to understand what was the model missing? What was the model classifying as a suicidal post or non-suicidal when we thought the opposite? So for a false negative example, this is a post that our group labeled as suicidal, but the model labeled it as non-suicidal. And so the post, I highlighted some points here, but they mentioned this 22 a day statistic. Without the help of the VA, I would not be doing very well today. If you're in a dark place, recommend you go to the VA. So this is a little bit more of a read between the lines post. And I remember specifically that our team talked about this one at length. They're mentioning the 22 veterans a day. They're talking about how they wouldn't be doing very well today after having just mentioned the 22 a day. There's some implied meaning here that this person was suicidal at this point, or at some point. But it's not surprising that the model missed this one. It's a little bit more of an implicit description of suicide. And so it's a good indicator of the model is probably doing pretty well. It's maybe missing ambiguous or vague posts. As another example, this is a false positive. So we labeled this as non-suicidal, and the model thought this was suicidal. Persons mentioning taking medications, drinking, experiencing a lot of stressors, divorce, unemployment, loss of children. They went through cognitive processing therapy, through rehab. Now they're clean. They're managing their PTSD. So again, based on our code book, this is a non-suicidal post. This person's not explicitly or implicitly mentioning anything about suicide, but they obviously are experiencing a lot of different risk factors and have gone through something that they've really struggled with. The model is picking this up as, is this, this could be a suicidal post. We think this is a clearer case if it's not a suicidal post. But there is some ambiguity there just in terms of the volume, like the description of the number of risk factors that are listed that seem to have confused the model. So overall, from this error analysis, and we looked at every example, false negative and false positive. This is just a couple. There weren't that many instances of either, but the model was overall doing well. And after you see the interventions that we have running on the site right now, for folks who clearly have risk factors like this person here, but aren't explicitly mentioning suicide, we don't anticipate any harm from these interventions, and they could still potentially be helpful for these other people as well, because they're mostly interventions encouraging people to kind of reach out for extra support and resources when they need it. We did some additional analyses to look at and try to better understand which words are helping the model distinguish between suicidal and non-suicidal posts. We have this lovely figure that is in the paper version that you can go look at later because it's a link and you can go interact and hover over each of these data points for more information. But just to distill this all into something that makes more sense for this presentation, the words that were more likely to appear in suicidal posts were, not surprisingly, suicide-related words, suicide risk factor related words, help-seeking words, first-person singular pronouns, and negations, so not, can't, don't. Especially these two here, first-person pronouns and negations, this aligns with other research on how people talk about suicide on other social media platforms. So it's consistent with existing literature. Words that are more likely to appear in non-suicidal posts are third-person singular pronouns, topics about war and military history, and religion, which these are big topics on the Rally Point site that users like to talk about. So just to sum up the algorithm work, our algorithm that we developed to identify at-risk users performs well. The best fitting model incorporated the content of the post as well as metadata information about the post and about the user. And results of our semantic analysis align with prior research, specifically around first person and negation and suicide terms. We did observe more veterans in our sample compared to the Rally Point user base, kind of just based on what we talked about earlier about the role of stigma and the very real career impacts that active duty service members can experience from disclosing about suicide. It maybe makes sense that even on this site where there is relative anonymity, more veterans are willing to disclose things that they're struggling with compared to active duty service members, even though there are more active duty service members on Rally Point than there are veterans. A couple limitations to note. We did have a low incidence of suicidal posts on the site. As you saw, we had about 10% suicidal posts and 90% non-suicidal for all of our models. This is limiting, it's class imbalance. It's pretty common in studies looking at suicide. It's a low base rate of this phenomenon, but nevertheless can create challenges. We use class weights in our final Roberta model to try to address this, but it's still a limitation at the end of the day. Because of the low incidence, we had to stick with the broad definition of suicidal thoughts and behaviors in human labeling. We weren't able to distinguish between current, like imminent suicide risk or like someone describing an event that had already happened. Of course, if the goal is to use this to be like flagging people for immediate intervention, a model that was trained on data that was only current suicide risk would probably be more appropriate to have, but we were limited in our ability to be able to do that because we had very few posts that were about current, like someone's actively in a suicidal crisis in this moment. And I'll just make a broad note that we don't really know exactly who Rally Point users are. There are a lot of people who use Rally Point, but we don't necessarily know whether these folks are representative of all US service members or veterans. And we still need prospective evaluation of this model and to see how it does in real time as it's identifying people at risk. What are we doing right now? The current directions and kind of where this project has taken us. Right now, this model is it's active and it's deployed on the Rally Point site to be detecting suicidal posts in real time, which is going to allow for that prospective evaluation of the model. And then we came to the next question of what do we actually do once potentially at-risk users have been identified by the model. And we had a lot of conversations with our partners at Rally Point to explore different intervention options. So one of the learnings I would say from this project is about being able to work with the industry partner and meeting them where they're at in terms of resources, their organizational philosophy, the time they have to give to this project. And for Rally Point, it was super, super important to them to keep the human connection piece. That's why they want people to come to Rally Point. They wanted initially why they got involved with and reached out to Harvard in the first place was because they wanted to improve the detection of suicidal posts on the site more sensitively. They were afraid that they were missing a lot. they weren't sure that what they were reaching out to folks about was the best way to present resources, and they wanted us to advise and help them come up with a better system. But they wanted to keep this human loop approach. They wanted humans to be going and reviewing false positives or reviewing posts and determining if it was a false positive and actually making contact with the at-risk user. They were open to exploring automated interventions if we could show that they were effective or were more effective than just having someone reach out. And they needed low burden for their eng team. They had a very small engineering team, and they were okay with having a higher burden for site moderators, so people who could actually be going and reaching out to people directly on the site. And because of the scale of suicidal users that we are seeing on Rally Point, it was still quite low. This was a feasible option for them, is to still have humans directly reaching out. If you were to apply something like this, or for active models that are running on major social media sites, it gets less and less feasible, obviously, as there are more and more posts that are getting flagged. But this model and this solution worked for Rally Point. And so what we proposed was just combining the AI side of things, like having the algorithm flag posts that were concerning, but then having a human go and actually review and conduct the intervention. That's what Rally Point was most comfortable with at this early stage. We also have a branch that I'll show in a second where we are testing an automated intervention to see if it does kind of add something above and beyond what they're doing right now of having someone directly reach out, because they were open to that. And of course, this still allows for the opportunity for users on the site to just manually report or flag concerning posts, which they also wanted to preserve the ability to be getting feedback from other sources about potentially concerning posts, just as another safety net in case the model was missing anything. So right now this algorithm is integrated, deployed on Rally Point. It's running in the background. It's automatically detecting suicidal posts in real time. The time delay is about 5 seconds. Like, it's very fast. And most of these posts, of course, are no suspected risk, no action is taken. But for that subset that the model thinks might be at risk, what we ended up setting up to be a very low engineering burden was we just have all these posts flagging to a Slack channel where Rally Point can go and see, as it's coming in, posts that are being flagged. And so this is what it looks like on Slack. Each of the different alerts comes in like this. And when you click on any one of these messages, it expands and shows the full post that the person made on Rally Point. And it also shows the model's predicted score of how likely they think it is that this is a suicidal post, with 1 being the highest. So the model is pretty darn confident that this post contains suicidal description, and it's correct. This person writes about trying to find their peace. They really don't want to be one of the 22. Have given it many a thought, have even tried. So they're describing that they've made a suicide attempt in the past. So once the Slack ping comes in, what we're doing now and what's ongoing on the site is people get randomized to one of 2 conditions. They either get this current treatment as usual approach that Rally Point is it's tried and true for them, and something that they like doing is making direct contact with their users. And so half people get treatment as usual with the current protocol, which is a Rally Point moderator reaching out to them and DMing them with resources. We did also help refine these resources and refine the language that the Rally Point staff members are using to message people, just based on other suicide focused intervention work that we've done in the lab. And so we did some refinements here, but it's, at the end of the day, still that same protocol of someone directly reaching out. Then the other half of people who get a flag here get the same treatment as usual, plus an automated barrier reduction intervention that automatically displays to them in their newsfeed. The barrier reduction intervention, basically, and I'm sure that some of you are familiar with this idea already, but it's basically an intervention that provides psychoeducational information to try to encourage people to seek out resources and help them work through some of the barriers that might be keeping them from reaching out. And I'll show an example of what this looks like in a minute. But this type of intervention has been previously shown to increase the use of crisis services by other people in Matt Nock's research group. And so this is an ongoing active clinical trial that's registered on clinicaltrials.gov, still happening on the site right now. It's a bit of a slow run because there aren't that many suicidal posts on the site, but it is still in progress. So what does this actually look like? Um, this right here, this is just me and a test account on this site. So I made the post right here, I want to kill myself. I mean, you couldn't get much more explicit than that. So, but I just wanted to do a demo of the model working as expected. So I wrote this here. I'm just going to play the video. So when I go to press post update, how it works on Rally Point is this post automatically goes to the top of the news feed, which is below. So you can see the blue highlight that came up. This is the post that I just made. And so the model automatically flags this and it shows the user a banner saying, sounds like you're going through something difficult. We care about you and want to help. Click here to learn more about resources available to you. So once they, and I will also just point out that there is an X here. Like if someone doesn't like this or they don't want it, they can just remove it. It will still show on future posts, but it won't keep populating back up if someone X's out of this, which is another thing that Rally Point cared about. They didn't want to be feeling like they were pushing interventions on people, which, makes a lot of sense. So when you press next, it just gives like 988, call 911 if you can't keep yourself safe. And then next again, and just ask how likely are you to use these resources. Now, if someone presses highly likely, they get a follow-up that says like, great, please reach out, help keep yourself safe, like take care, like a kind of a message like that. But if they press not likely, then the barrier reduction intervention comes up. And what this intervention looks like is a list of barriers that are specific to this community from some prior work I've done in other literature about reasons why service members and veterans don't want to reach out for mental health care. Things like feeling like they can handle their own problems, treatment's too expensive, I'm concerned about getting my firearms taken away, like a list of very common things that we've seen come up time and time again. When people click on any one of these given boxes, which we just tell them to click on any that resonate with them, what they receive is a little blurb that provides either a combination of psychoeducational information, normalization of like it's normal to feel this way, some validation in there, all with the goal of trying to combat these barriers and provide a little bit of something, nudge of something to encourage people to reach out despite this concern that they have. So just as an example, if they click, I can handle my own problem, it just says something about it's, talking about problems has been shown to help us make sense of them. Some people might feel embarrassed or ashamed, but it's a badge of strength that you're able to put pride aside and get support. So this is a combination of education around this can be helpful to talk about. It's normalizing and validating that this can feel embarrassing or shameful to talk about. And then this badge of strength language came directly from focus groups we had with people at Rally Point around kind of military community specific phrasing or language that might resonate more with users. What we don't have here is like, here's a study, a citation of like, this is really helpful to talk about something. That was not going to resonate with this community. We did talk about that option. If some of us were trying to make a decision, like I always, I'm going and Googling things and trying to figure out the evidence for something, but you have to think about obviously the group that you're targeting here. And all these messages were reviewed by not only the folks at Rally Point, which includes lived experience, veterans and service members who are part of the staff there, also external collaborators involved in either who are service members themselves or do research in military community. We reviewed all these comments or blurbs with them. So I'm not going to go through every one just for the sake of time, but basically you just scroll down, you can click on any ones you want, get the little blurbs. And then at the end, when you press next, it just is another reminder, nothing else, just here's the numbers again, take care. And then they press next and then it's done. So what we're interested in here is who actually is contacting emergency services. Are people in either condition, treatment as usual or treatment as usual plus this barrier reduction? Are they actually calling 911 or 988? And so we send them a brief survey. The survey comes through Rally Point and also to their email. And it's literally two questions, and it's just asked, did you call one of these resources or not? And we send that a couple times just to get any kind of real data on the impact that the intervention may have had and encouraging them to seek out resources. And we expect, based on prior research, that the intervention condition with the barrier reduction intervention will have a higher utilization rate for those resources, and still in progress. I'll just briefly go through one of the other interventions we have running on the site, and I'll be done and open for questions. But this is on the side of you're scrolling through Rally Point and you see someone else, one of your peers, who's made a post about suicide. And how can we encourage people to engage with those posts in a supportive way to potentially help people who might be in need. So for this intervention, users are provided psychoeducational information aimed at increasing the number of peer responses, helpful peer responses on potentially at-risk posts that are identified by the algorithm. So any Rally Point user is a target here, and half of the active users are randomized to see the intervention, and the other half don't see the intervention. And what the intervention looks like is this: like if you're scrolling through your news feed and see this post that one of your peers made about, I want to die right now, this is flagged saying this person might be going through something difficult. To learn about what to say to people in distress, click here. And it's just a very simple acronym based intervention about, acknowledge, care, and tell, basically validating people, expressing empathy, and suggesting resources, with a note down here about don't go into your own suicide methods or suicidal history. Um, so we're trying to see if seeing something just very brief like this has any impact on people. And what we're mostly interested in is, does this have an impact on the content of the posts, the comments that they're providing in response to at-risk posts? Like, would we see more supportive replies for people who have engaged with this intervention versus control? What about just overall their posting in general? Is there any impact once they kind of pause and think about validation and empathy? We're curious to see. It's a very low, like uh, low burden intervention that is very light touch. So we're not sure if we will see an effect, but it'd be great if we did. And we also are curious to see if people's posts will contain any content that's directly kind of related to this intervention about providing validation or empathy. We'll also just look at generally, how is this landing with people? Like, are they even clicking on this? What content in the post maybe triggers people to engage with it more? Like, are people more likely to click on the, I want to help my peer if the post is about suicide, for example? And those will all be things that we'll be able to explore as we get more data here. So just the broad takeaways for this work. We know that, just to summarize, service members and veterans are, of course, at elevated risk for suicide. It's challenging to help people who need it get help because people are often not going through traditional healthcare. So with our industry partners, we developed a suicide risk algorithm that can identify people who might be in risk in real time on social media. We're now using that algorithm to identify at-risk users for these light touch interventions on the site. And this work's still ongoing, still involved in it in my new role. But we're just waiting to get more participants enrolled in some of these trials. This work has involved a lot of people over many years. So I just want to briefly acknowledge the large team here from Harvard, Rally Point, MIT, AWS, and our funding source. All the algorithm stuff that I presented on first is already published in Psych Medicine if you want to go read that paper. And the other research will be hopefully published soon. And with that all being said, I will stop here for questions, comments, anything else. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Gosh, that is so fascinating. And it's so great that you're doing research and impacting people simultaneously, which is like at the heart of what we care about. So I loved hearing more detail than we heard at ABCT. It's just really
Yeah, I
great.
tried to beef it up a little bit for this
Oh
talk.
no, it's great because, it all went so fast at ABCT.
Yeah.
It was harder to take it in. and to see more about what you're intervening. We've got folks on the call who've been doing work with our Google project where we're trying to detect suicide risk in search data and YouTube data as well as TikTok data. And so I think this is really relevant. And we also have projects with veterans and service members where we're doing entirely online research. And so kind of some of these issues around how do you provide resources? And I'm thinking, Barbara and Anna, about the some of the barrier reduction ideas around some of our folks who were like trying to get them to be interested in resources and sometimes they're not always so interested in the resources. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. But at that point, I'll just stop talking and give other people a shot.
I'm still chewing on questions, but Kelly, I really like how you all did the more qualitative person coding stuff before putting the model on it. I really feel like that enhances the validity of
Yeah.
kind of what the model was doing and whatnot. And I really appreciated that piece, even though it probably was incredibly labor intensive and whatnot. Like I feel like it adds such value. Um, and also just like seeing the outcome of like the barrier and reduction, like Kate was saying, I really like how there's like that checkbox and then it like pops up like here's kind of a counterpoint and whatnot.
Right.
It reminds me of some of the help seeking stuff that Tracy Stecker was working on a few years ago. So yeah, it's really cool. Still
Thank you.
chewing on questions, but
Yeah.
Did
I think,
that, oh,
no,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Barbara.
I was just gonna ask, I really like the psychoeducation piece that you talked about at the end there. Did that come from things that you were seeing in the post? Because I keep thinking about that person that said that they were worried about their brother who had an attempt and like how he could like help him.
Yeah.
Um, so it just seemed like those fit really well together, and I was curious like how that came up.
Yeah. Do you mean for the one that's like trying to get peers to support their
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that was actually adapted from a model of a similar peer support intervention that was just very brief in trying to kind of like not overwhelm people with too much information. But in general, I think what we did see on a lot of the posts, and there actually was an example of it early on in the presentation on when I had a screenshot of one of the Rally Point staff members replying, and then there actually was another user who replied being like, I went through the same thing. Like that's most often what we were seeing. And so that is why we added the blurb of trying to, of course, like having shared lived experience can be really valuable. And also, depending on where someone's at in their process of kind of coping with whatever they're going through on their own, it's not necessarily going to be super helpful to just hear details about someone else's struggle rather than this person sharing, I've also struggled and here's what was helpful for me. And so we tried to redirect from kind of what we were already observing from people naturally doing, which was people are really open to talk about themselves, but how can we flip that on listening a little bit more, providing a little bit more empathy, and then relating it to what resources worked for you?
Yeah, really cool work. Thank you
Yeah,
for
thank you.
I'm impressed also that your ability to collect follow-up data through rally points. Like to me, this is what we all wish. This struck me at the ABC too. This is what we all wish social media research experiences would be like. You know, we started our Google study right when like Google was always scared of any like people have to individually download their data. Like
Right.
it's a very cumbersome process to try to deal with Google. And then everybody else sort of was like a dominoes of all the tech companies being like, yeah, we're not giving out our data anymore and we're not partnering with research in that way. If you get the individual to download their data, that's on you, that's
Totally.
on them. And so like when I think of what we could do if our other projects were actually partnering with the
Totally.
social media company in the way that Rally Point.
Yeah.
does,
Right.
and the potential is
Yeah,
like huge.
totally agree. And I think that that is, as much as we were kind of like, let's go in, guns blazing, like automated interventions and like we're going to do all this cool stuff. It was also one of the reasons why Rally Point was so open and proactive in seeking out Matt's lab and wanting to form this partnership was because these issues are very personal to them. Most of the Rally Point staff are veterans themselves. They're seeing these posts on the site. They're not sure the best way. None of them are trained in a psychological, clinical stuff. And so we had to meet them where they were at. And I think what a lot of these other companies are similarly struggling with is the liability aspect and what to do when things kind of go wrong or don't go as planned. And so for Rally Point, it was the most comfortable and kind of conservative option to use these automated methods to improve the human's ability to handle these issues head on. And then we had some clinical training that we did with them on best practices for talking to people who were struggling as kind of a secondary component of this. But it definitely is a balance for wanting to automate, move fast, catch people, but also what do you do when you have a large pool of people might be at risk, and are you going to be liable for those folks?
Yeah, absolutely. Michelle, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for showcasing this work. It's really like inspiring. It's really awesome to hear about. I had a question you said earlier about some of the flagging that happens, and then some information or some posts were flagged to like a moderator.
Mhm.
Can you talk more about what that looked like of Rally Point? I'm not familiar with Rally Point, so I'm curious like what that
Yeah.
looks like for the moderators.
They had a couple of their full-time staff at Rally Point who were just moderators as well and would have a moderator account set up on the site. So basically in their inbox on Rally Point, and they were getting notified through other means as well. But these people were like on Rally Point all the time. So they were seeing these things that it would basically flag to their inbox when users made a flag about another post, and then they could go do a manual review of that post. The people who were doing the moderating, it was really like, this is kind of it was a small operation. I mean, it still is a small operation. It's bigger now. But the main guy who was doing it, Carlos, who I showed his photo and a screenshot, he was literally like a product manager and just like
Yeah.
helping and moderating on the,
Mhm.
so it's kind of
Mhm.
like startup vibes, like everyone has to kind of jump in and help as needed.
Mhm.
And he just had like a particular interest in getting involved in that. And that's kind of why he picked that up, or else it would have been someone else who got involved. But they had a couple people like that who just took it on as part of their day to day.
So they would see a post and they would they like reach out to that user and say, "Hey, it looks like you're going through
Yeah,
something."
exactly.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, and engage with them. Yeah.
And would they take down the post or they would just intervene and in some way
Yeah,
reach
just
out?
offer resources. I mean,
Okay.
they have their terms and conditions about, posts that aren't allowed.
Okay.
And so if they kind of went to that level, there would be that kind of moderation that happened. But in general, people were encouraged to talk about their mental health on the site, and that
Sure.
was like a safe space to do so. So they weren't taking down posts. So it was only if things were like really graphic or like images
Got it.
and things like
Okay.
that. Yeah. So it
Okay.
wasn't moderation to remove. So it's a good
Got
point to
it.
clarify. Thank you for bringing that up. It
Okay.
was moderating just what's going on the site and taking appropriate action steps from posts that have been flagged.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
We only have a minute or two left, but I'm curious if you wanted to share a little bit what you're doing at Crisis Text Line, what your new job looks
Yeah.
like, and for people who might want to reach out and, create collaboration or.
Yeah, totally. So I work on a team. There's a couple of us who are kind of there as the clinical experts. My title is a principal clinical research scientist, and we work with a really strong group of machine learning engineers who are doing like some of the NLP type work that I just showed here. And so my role is really to be guiding those projects and looking to answer important research questions, not only for science in general, but questions that can improve the service that's offered, the crisis intervention service that's offered, and improve the product experience, the service experience overall for users. And so we're working with a data set of over 11 million conversations. And it's a lot of people use crisis text line. About 3,000 people a day text crisis text line. So we have this really rich data set of the texter and counselor conversations that we have to work with, better understand people who are texting in, what kind of crises are they experiencing, how can we help them, what types of counselor behaviors are helpful. And we have a good portion of people who fill out a self-report post-conversation survey that we're able to look at some user-reported outcomes around helpfulness and how they were feeling kind of after the call as well. But a lot of the work is NLP driven. And then just, yeah, writing papers, writing grants, it's still a lot of the same types of research activities that I was doing in an academic capacity as well, just now in the nonprofit sector.
That's great. That is really cool. That's a great job.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate.
Yeah, I think that I'm sure it's a press in a very different kind of way than Harvard.
The scale of is wild. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's a 250 person company, and so research impact is growing. I expect we'll probably have some, don't hold me to it, but some more roles opening up in the coming years. For anyone who's curious or just curious about industry, feel free to reach out.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Peyton has posted our evaluation in the chat. We'd love to get feedback. We'll pass that on to Kelly, and also just to give us input on the kind of work you'd like to see. And just want to call out that next month, Joey Chung, one of our former trainees who did a training project on EMA as an intervention as well as an outcome assessment for folks with non-suicidal self-injury, will be presenting on her project. So we'd love to have you join us for that as well. Thank you again, Kelly. This was so great. I'm so delighted to hear all this.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.